Alexander Sterling, a billionaire, returns from a humanitarian trip in Africa and arrives at his corporate headquarters in New York City looking disheveled, almost like a homeless person. Sarah Miller, the receptionist, doesn't recognize him, and, out of fear and following protocols, treats him with disdain. She not only denies Alexander entry, but publicly humiliates him, speaking loudly about people like him not belonging there and suggesting he seek shelter. Alexander, shocked, decides not to reveal his identity to observe how he is treated without his power. Little does Sarah know, Alexander owns the entire empire. But before we reveal what happens next, if stories like this touch your heart, click subscribe now and help us bring you more tales of courage and loyalty. Thank you. Now, let's see what happened. Sarah adjusted the crisp white collar of her blouse for the third time that morning, watching her reflection in the mirrored glass of Sterling Enterprises' impressive lobby. The 40-story building rose majestically in the heart of Manhattan's financial district, and she still couldn't quite believe she worked there. At 28, after much hard work, she had finally landed her dream job as the head receptionist of one of the largest corporations in the country. The salary wasn't extraordinary, but it represented stability, something Sarah hadn't known for a long time. Since moving from a small town in upstate New York to the city 5 years ago, she had worked various jobs: diners, department stores, small offices. Always with the same goal in mind, to earn enough to support her mom, Carol, who had been alone since her dad's untimely passing. Carol Miller had been diagnosed with severe rheumatoid arthritis 2 years prior, a condition that drastically limited her movements and prevented her from working. The medications were expensive, the appointments frequent, and the basic health insurance Sarah could afford only covered the essentials. Therefore, in addition to her job at Sterling Enterprises during the day, Sarah also spent her nights working as a server at a 24-hour diner in her neighborhood in Queens. Alexander Sterling, a billionaire, returns from a humanitarian trip in Africa and arrives at his corporate headquarters in New York City looking disheveled, almost like a homeless person. Sarah Miller, the receptionist, doesn't recognize him, and out of fear and following protocols, treats him with disdain. She not only denies Alexander entry, but publicly humiliates him, speaking loudly about people like him not belonging there and suggesting he seek shelter. Alexander, shocked, decides not to reveal his identity to observe how he is treated without his power. Little does Sarah know, Alexander owns the entire empire. But before we reveal what happens next, if stories like this touch your heart, click subscribe now and help us bring you more tales of courage and loyalty. Thank you. Now let's see what happened. It was almost 16 hours of work per day, 7 days a week. Sarah slept an average of 4 hours a night, always rushing between jobs, between doctor's visits with her mother and professional commitments. But she didn't complain. In fact, she felt grateful. Sterling Enterprises represented not only a better salary, but the possibility of professional growth that she had always dreamed of. The lobby where she worked was impressive. Italian marble on the floor, a giant crystal chandelier hanging from the double-height ceiling, and a panoramic view of Fifth Avenue through the enormous glass windows. Sarah had memorized every detail of that space in the 3 months she had worked there. She knew the name of every employee who passed by daily, from the executives in impeccable suits to the cleaning crew who arrived before dawn. Her desk was strategically positioned to control all access to the building. It was a responsibility that Sarah took very seriously. The company's security depended in part on her attention to detail. She had memorized the security protocols, knew how to identify authorized personnel, and had developed a keen instinct for detecting anything out of the ordinary. That Tuesday morning, Sarah was particularly cheerful. The night before, Carol had had a better night, with less pain, which always made Sarah feel more at ease. Furthermore, she had received praise from the security supervisor for how she had handled a delicate situation the previous week, when she prevented an unauthorized visitor from accessing the elevators. "Good morning, Sarah," greeted Mr. Thompson, the human resources manager, passing by the reception desk with his usual friendly smile. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. How's your wife doing?" Sarah always remembered to ask about people's families. It was natural for her, a genuine kindness that everyone appreciated. "Very well. Thank you for asking. And your mother, how is she?" "Getting better, thank you." This was the kind of interaction that Sarah valued most in her job. Despite the necessary formality of her position, she had managed to create warm relationships with many company employees. She was respectful to everyone, from the CEO, whom she had only seen once briefly during a presentation for new employees, to the cleaning crew, with whom she always exchanged a few kind words. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Sterling Enterprises, Sarah speaking, good morning." "Hi, honey." Her mother's voice on the other end of the line sounded weaker than usual. Sarah immediately felt a pang in her chest. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you okay?" "I am, dear, just a little more tired today. Don't worry, I just wanted to hear your voice." "Mom, did you take your medicine properly?" "Yes, I did." "Sarah, you don't need to worry so much about me. Take care of your work there." After she hung up, Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. It was always like that, a mixture of worry and determination. Each day was a silent battle to keep everything under control, to ensure her mother had the best possible treatment and not to fail in any of her responsibilities. She opened her eyes and resumed watching the activity in the lobby. Important people were constantly coming and going, national and international executives, investors, business partners. Sarah had learned to quickly identify who they were by the way they dressed, how they behaved, and how they were treated by other employees. The job required not only administrative competence, but also a keen social sensitivity. She needed to be courteous to everyone, but also firm when necessary. She needed to represent the company well, always being the first face visitors saw upon entering the building. Sometimes, especially in the early mornings when she was at the diner, Sarah allowed herself to dream of a different future. She imagined herself growing professionally within Sterling Enterprises, perhaps one day working on one of the upper floors, with a salary that would allow her to take better care of her mother without having to work two jobs. But she knew that dreams are achieved through hard work and dedication. Therefore, every day, Sarah strived to be the best professional she could be, treating each person with respect, protecting the company as if it were her own, and always maintaining the hope that better days would come. The clock read 10 in the morning when Sarah saw a strange commotion at the entrance of the building. Through the glass doors, she noticed a figure that caught her attention. Someone who definitely didn't seem to belong in that sophisticated corporate environment. The man approaching the glass doors of Sterling Enterprises looked completely out of place. Sarah observed with growing apprehension as he walked towards the main entrance. He was wearing worn and wrinkled clothes, a faded t-shirt, jeans ripped at the knees, and sneakers that had seen better days. His beard was long and unkempt, his hair disheveled, and he wasn't carrying any luggage or an executive briefcase. Sarah felt her heart race. In her 3 months on the job, she had handled a few delicate situations, but nothing like this. The man not only looked like a homeless person, but also moved with a strange determination towards the building, as if he had every right to be there. When he pushed the glass doors open and entered the lobby, Sarah immediately positioned herself behind her desk, discreetly pressing the security alert button under the counter. The contrast between that man and the sophisticated atmosphere of the lobby was stark. The Italian marble, the crystal chandelier, the well-dressed executives who constantly passed through the area. "Excuse me," the man said, approaching the reception desk with a surprisingly polite voice. But Sarah was already in full protection mode. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Sarah said, maintaining a professional but firm tone. "This is a private corporate building." Alexander Sterling stopped in front of the reception desk, observing the young woman before him. He had just arrived from his humanitarian trip in Africa, where he spent a month building clean water wells in remote villages. Technical problems with his private jet had forced him to take commercial flights with multiple connections, and his luggage had been lost somewhere between Lagos and New York. He was exhausted, dirty from the trip, and eager to get to his office to resolve urgent company matters. But the receptionist didn't seem to recognize him. This wasn't entirely surprising. Alexander rarely went down to the administrative floors, preferring to use the private entrance that led directly to his office on the top floor. Furthermore, his appearance was drastically different from usual. "I need to go up to the office," Alexander said calmly. "I have an important meeting." Sarah watched the man with even more suspicion. Now he was making up excuses to try to get in. This confirmed her suspicions that he was someone with dubious intentions. "Sir, you don't look like someone who would have a meeting here," Sarah said, her voice involuntarily getting louder. Some employees passing through the lobby began to notice the situation. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately." Alexander was genuinely surprised by the harshness of the treatment. When he was surrounded by his executive team and advisors, everyone always treated him with extreme deference. He had completely forgotten what it was like to be judged purely by appearance. "Young lady, I think there's a misunderstanding," Alexander tried again, but Sarah had already stood up from her chair. "There's no misunderstanding. Security!" Sarah shouted, waving desperately at the guards who were already approaching after receiving her silent alert. 2 uniformed security guards quickly arrived at the reception desk. Sarah felt relieved. She had followed all the correct protocols to protect the company. "Gentlemen, this man is trying to enter the building without authorization," Sarah explained to the guards, gesturing towards Alexander. "He says he has a meeting, but he clearly doesn't." Alexander looked around, watching as other employees had stopped to watch the scene. Well-dressed executives whispered amongst themselves, some discreetly taking pictures with their cell phones. The humiliation was complete and public. For a moment, Alexander considered revealing his identity. He could simply say his name, show some identification, and that whole embarrassing situation would end instantly. The guards would apologize, the receptionist would be mortified, and he could go up to his office. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the trip, or maybe a morbid curiosity about how he would be treated when he had no visible power or status. When was the last time someone had spoken to him without knowing who he was? When was the last time he had experienced the world as an ordinary person? "All right," Alexander said, raising his hands in surrender. "I'll leave." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and something she couldn't quite identify. The man wasn't being aggressive or insistent as she expected. In fact, there was a strange dignity in his withdrawal. "And sir," Sarah added, her voice now carrying an authority she didn't know she possessed, "there's a homeless shelter 3 blocks from here. They serve free meals at 11 o'clock. Alexander stopped at the door and turned to look at her. There was something in the receptionist's eyes that intrigued him, not pure cruelty, but a mixture of fear, protectiveness, and, strangely, genuine concern. "Thank you for the information," Alexander said, and left the building. Sarah returned to her desk, her heart still beating fast. The guards congratulated her on how she had handled the situation, and some employees who witnessed the scene praised her firmness and professionalism. But for the rest of the day, Sarah couldn't get the image of the man out of her head. There was something about him that bothered her. Not his appearance or behavior, but the calm and dignified way he had accepted the rejection. Most people in a similar situation would have yelled, argued, or caused a bigger scene. He had simply left. That night, during her shift at the diner, Sarah told Connie, the most experienced cook, about the incident. "You did the right thing, girl," said Connie. "Security is security. Can't mess around with that." But when Sarah arrived home in the early hours of the morning and lay down next to her mother, who was sleeping peacefully after taking her medication, she couldn't stop thinking about that man's eyes. There was something there she couldn't decipher. a deep sadness, but also a strange understanding, as if he perfectly understood why she had acted that way. The next morning, when Sarah arrived at work, she didn't expect to see the same man again. But there he was across the street, watching the Sterling Enterprises building with the same serene and enigmatic expression as the day before. Sarah watched the man across the street for a few minutes before entering the building. He was standing in front of a newsstand, flipping through a magazine, but his eyes occasionally drifted towards Sterling Enterprises. There was something different about him today. He looked cleaner, although he was still wearing the same simple clothes as the day before. Throughout the morning, Sarah found herself glancing out the window, checking if he was still there. Around 10 o'clock, the man crossed the street and approached the glass doors again. Sarah immediately braced herself, positioning her hand over the alert button, but this time decided to approach the situation differently. "Good morning," the man said, approaching the reception desk with the same polite tone as the day before. "Sir, we already talked about this yesterday," Sarah said, but her voice didn't have the same harshness. "You can't come in here." Alexander had spent the entire night in his apartment thinking about the encounter. It was the first time in years that someone had treated him without any deference or recognition of his status. The experience had been both humiliating and revealing. He decided to continue the experiment for a few more days, curious to understand how his own company functioned when viewed from below. "I understand," Alexander said calmly, "but I'd like to drop off a resume. I'm looking for a job." Sarah watched him with surprise. She hadn't expected that. The man didn't seem to be causing trouble or trying to force his way in. He was being respectful, almost humble. "Sir, a company like Sterling Enterprises has very specific hiring processes," Sarah explained, her voice softer. "You need to apply online, through the official website." "I don't have regular access to the internet," Alexander lied. "I thought maybe I could leave my basic information with someone." Sarah hesitated. There was something in the man's sincerity that touched her. She remembered her own job search, the countless times she had been rejected before getting the position at Sterling Enterprises. "Look, I'm going to be honest with you," Sarah said, leaning slightly over the counter. "A company at this level has very specific standards of presentation. You would need to—" She paused, searching for a gentle way to express herself. "Improve your appearance if you want to be taken seriously in any hiring process." Alexander was fascinated by the change in her tone. Yesterday had been pure confrontation and rejection. Today there was genuine advice, almost maternal. "You're right," Alexander said. "It's just, things have been difficult lately. But I really need an opportunity." Sarah felt her heart soften. There was something in that man's quiet dignity that reminded her of her own father, who had struggled so hard to support their family before his untimely passing. "Listen," Sarah said, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "There's a job training workshop 2 blocks from here. They help people prepare for interviews, teach them how to write resumes, things like that. Maybe you should start there." Alexander was genuinely touched by her attempt to help. "Thank you very much. May I ask your name?" "Sarah," she replied automatically, then corrected herself. "I mean Miss Miller." "Thank you, Miss Miller. My name is Alex." During the following days, a strange routine was established. Alexander appeared every morning, always outside the building, sometimes sitting on the park bench across the street, other times walking along the sidewalk. Sarah began to notice that he never asked passers-by for money, never caused disturbances, just watched the activity of the building. On the 3rd day, Sarah made a decision that she couldn't fully explain to herself. During her lunch break, she left the building and approached the bench where Alexander was sitting, reading a surprisingly sophisticated book on business management. "Hi," Sarah said, sitting hesitantly on the other side of the bench. "Hello, Miss Miller," Alexander replied, closing the book. "How is your day going?" "Well, thank you." Sarah observed the cover of the book. "Are you interested in management?" "I've always been interested in how companies work," Alexander said honestly, "especially how they treat their employees at different levels." It's interesting you say that, said Sarah. I've worked there for 3 months, and one of the things that impresses me most about Sterling Enterprises is how they value all employees. From the cleaning crew to the executives. Alexander smiled inwardly. If she only knew how many complaints reached his office about unequal treatment between departments. Do you like working there? Alexander asked. I love it, replied Sarah sincerely. It's the best job I've ever had. The salary allows me to take care of my mother, and I feel like I'm part of something important. Sterling Enterprises does amazing projects around the world. Your mother is sick? Sarah hesitated before answering. She didn't know why she was sharing personal information with a stranger, but something about Alex made her feel comfortable. She has rheumatoid arthritis. It's complicated. That's why I also work at night at a diner. The medications are expensive. Alexander felt a pang of guilt. Here was a dedicated employee of his company, working 2 jobs to pay for medical treatments, while he had just spent more money on his humanitarian trip than she probably earned in a year. That must be very difficult, Alexander said softly. It is, but we manage. My mother always taught me that hard work and honesty open all doors. They talked for a few more minutes before Sarah needed to go back to work. As she got up to leave, Alexander said, Miss Miller, thank you for being kind to me. I know my appearance doesn't help, but it means a lot to have someone who treats me like a human being. Sarah stopped and looked at him. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, Alex, regardless of their current situation. That afternoon, while Sarah worked at the reception desk, she reflected on her conversation with Alex. There was something about him that intrigued her more and more. Despite his disheveled appearance, he spoke politely, demonstrated knowledge of complex subjects, and there was a sadness in his eyes that seemed deeper than just financial difficulties. During her night shift at the diner, Sarah told Connie about her conversations with Alex. Be careful, girl, warned the experienced cook. Sometimes we get involved with people we don't really know. But Sarah couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something about Alex that awakened not only her compassion, but also her curiosity. It was as if he were a puzzle she needed to solve. The next day, Sarah made an even bolder decision. She bought an extra sandwich during lunch and offered it to Alex, who was in his usual spot on the park bench. Thank you, said Alexander, genuinely touched by the gesture. But I can't accept your food. Please, insisted Sarah. I know what it's like to go through hard times. It was then that Alexander realized that he had completely underestimated that young receptionist. She wasn't just an employee following protocols. She was a person with depth, compassion, and an inner strength that he rarely saw, even among his most experienced executives. The situation changed drastically in the second week. Sarah arrived at work on a Thursday morning to find Mr. Thompson, the human resources manager, waiting for her at the reception desk with a serious expression she had never seen before. Sarah, we need to talk, said Mr. Thompson, indicating a small meeting room near the lobby. Sarah's heart leaped. In her years of professional experience, she knew that conversations that started that way rarely had happy endings. She followed Mr. Thompson to the room, her legs trembling slightly. Please sit down, said Mr. Thompson, closing the door. I've received some complaints about your recent behavior. Complaints? Sarah couldn't hide the surprise in her voice. About what? Apparently, you've been seen talking to a homeless person during your work hours. Some employees have reported that you left the building during your shift to talk to this person. And yesterday, you were seen sharing food. Sarah felt her face flush. Mr. Thompson, it was my lunch break. I wasn't working. Sarah, you understand that your position here requires absolute discretion, right? You're the first face that our clients and investors see when they enter this building. Your image directly reflects on the image of Sterling Enterprises. But I was just being kind to someone who needs help, protested Sarah. It doesn't interfere with my work. Mr. Thompson sighed deeply. Sarah, I really like you. You're an exemplary employee, always punctual, competent, dedicated, but the board is concerned about the inappropriate association you're making. Inappropriate association? Sarah's voice rose an octave. Mr. Thompson, we're talking about a human being. I haven't done anything wrong. The problem isn't what you did, Sarah. It's the perception that it creates. We have international investors visiting the company constantly. If they see our head receptionist fraternizing with homeless people, he's not a homeless person, Sarah blurted out, surprising herself with the vehemence of her defense. Alex is an educated person who's going through hard times. He doesn't even ask for money or cause trouble. Mr. Thompson watched her with growing concern. Sarah, you're getting emotionally involved with this person. That's exactly what can't happen. I'm not getting emotionally involved, lied Sarah, although she knew it wasn't completely true. I'm just being human. Look, Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. The board has given me a clear instruction. Either you completely stop interacting with this person, or we'll have to reconsider your position here. The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Losing this job would be catastrophic. It would mean going back to unstable jobs, low wages, not being able to properly pay for her mother's treatment. It would mean disappointing Carol, who was so proud of her daughter's professional progress. I understand, said Sarah with a trembling voice. I'm glad to hear it, said Mr. Thompson, his expression softening slightly. Sarah, you have a bright future here at Sterling Enterprises. Don't let an emotional decision ruin everything you've built. Sarah spent the rest of the day working mechanically, greeting visitors, answering phones, organizing documents. But her mind was in complete turmoil. Every time she looked out the window and saw Alex sitting on the park bench, she felt a mixture of guilt and revolt. During lunch, she deliberately stayed inside the building, avoiding any visual contact with Alex. She saw when he looked towards the building, clearly expecting to see her, and felt her heart break a little. That night, at the diner shift, Sarah was quieter than usual. Connie noticed immediately. "What's wrong, girl? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah told the cook everything, about the conversation with Mr. Thompson, about the threat to her position, about how she felt divided between her professional responsibilities and her conscience. "Oh, honey," sighed Connie, "life sometimes forces us to make difficult choices. You have to think about your mother, your future. That man, he'll find another way." "But what if he doesn't?" asked Sarah, her voice full of anguish. "What if he really needs help and I'm the only person who's being kind to him?" "Sarah, you can't save everyone. Sometimes we have to be practical." When Sarah arrived home that early morning, she found Carol awake, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea. "Honey, are you okay? You seem worried." Sarah sat down next to her mother, fighting back tears. "Mum, what would you do if you had to choose between doing the right thing and protecting our livelihood?" Carol observed her daughter carefully. "Why are you asking that?" Sarah told her mother the whole story, about Alex, about their conversations, about the threat at work. Carol listened in silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Sarah," said Carol finally, "you've always been a big-hearted girl. Ever since you were little, you brought injured animals home, defended children who were being bullied at school. It's one of the things I admire most about you. But now, my big heart might cost us everything," Sarah said bitterly. "Honey, I've lived a long time in this world. I've seen people make choices out of fear, out of convenience, out of security. And you know what I've learned? That when we betray who we really are for any reason, we lose a little piece of our soul." "But Mom, if I lose this job..." "If you lose this job, we'll manage. We always have. But if you lose your humanity, your ability to care about other people, then we lose something we can't get back." Sarah hugged her mother, feeling tears finally streaming down her face. "I don't know what to do, Mom." "Yes, you do, honey. Deep down in your heart, you already know." The next morning, Sarah arrived at work with a decision made. but a heavy heart. She saw Alex on the park bench and waved discreetly to him, indicating that she couldn't come out to talk. He seemed to understand, waved back, and continued reading his book. Throughout the morning, Sarah worked with mechanical efficiency, but felt as if she were betraying a fundamental part of herself. Every time her eyes met Alex's through the window, she felt a pang of shame. Around 11 o'clock, the situation took a completely unexpected turn. A group of Japanese investors arrived for an important meeting, and Sarah was greeting them professionally when she noticed Alex approaching the doors of the building. Her heart leaped. If he tried to come in now in front of the investors, it would be the end of everything. But Alex didn't try to come in. Instead, he stayed outside, clearly wanting to get Sarah's attention. He was gesturing discreetly, trying to communicate something urgent. Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice: ignore Alex completely to keep her job, or find out what he was trying to say and risk her career in front of the most important investors she had ever served. Sarah watched Alex through the glass doors, her heart divided between professional fear and a growing concern. He wasn't trying to enter, but his gestures were urgent, almost desperate. There was something different about his posture today, a tension she had never seen before. The Japanese investors were being led to the elevators by Mr. Thompson when Sarah made a decision that could cost her her job. She asked her temporary replacement to cover the reception desk for 5 minutes and discreetly left the building. "Alex, what's happening?" asked Sarah as soon as she approached him. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," said Alexander, his voice filled with an urgency she had never heard before. "About who I really am." "What do you mean?" Alexander hesitated. In recent weeks, watching Sarah work, talking to her during lunch breaks, he had developed something he hadn't experienced in years: a genuine connection with another person that wasn't based on his status or wealth. The idea of revealing his identity and possibly losing that authenticity terrified him. "Sarah, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I'm not who you think I am." "Alex, I need to get back inside," said Sarah, looking nervously at the doors of the building. "If my boss sees me out here..." "That's exactly what I need to talk about," said Alexander. "Your job, you could lose it because of me." Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. "Why are you asking that?" "Because I overheard a conversation last night. There were 2 men in suits talking about the receptionist at Sterling Enterprises who was inappropriately fraternizing with bums." Sarah's blood ran cold. "You heard this where?" "At the restaurant where I sometimes get temporary work washing dishes." Alexander lied. "They were having dinner, talking about business, and they mentioned an employee who might be fired." Sarah felt her legs grow weak. If company executives were discussing her case in public restaurants, the situation was even worse than she had imagined. "They mentioned your name, Sarah, and they said the decision would be made today." "Today?" Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. Alexander saw the despair spreading across her face and felt a pang of terrible guilt. He was lying about how he had obtained the information, but not about the fact itself. Mr. Thompson had indeed mentioned during an executive meeting that an employee would need to be repositioned due to corporate image issues. "Sarah, I can't let you lose your job because of me," said Alexander. "I'll leave. I'll stop coming here. I'll get out of your life so you can keep your position." "No!" Sarah's response was more vehement than she expected. "Alex, you don't understand. It's not about you. It's about who I am as a person." "What do you mean?" "If I let them force me to stop talking to you, then what kind of person am I really? If I can only be kind when it's convenient, when there's no risk, then my kindness isn't worth anything." Alexander was deeply touched by the conviction in her voice. "Sarah, you have responsibilities. Your mother." "My mother taught me that our humanity can't be negotiated," interrupted Sarah. "If I lose this job for treating you with dignity, then maybe this isn't the right place for me." At that moment, Alexander realized that he was in love. Not with Sarah's appearance or her position. He didn't even know that was possible. but with her unwavering integrity, her moral courage, her refusal to compromise her values even in the face of devastating consequences. "Sarah," said Alexander softly, "you are an extraordinary person." Before Sarah could answer, Mr. Thompson appeared at the doors of the building. "Sarah, what are you doing out here?" Sarah turned around, her heart pounding. "Mr. Thompson, I just—" "Inside now," said Mr. Thompson, his voice filled with authority and disappointment. Sarah looked one last time at Alex, seeing something strange in his eyes, a determination that wasn't there before, as if he had made some important decision. "Go," said Alexander gently. "I'll take care of this." "How?" asked Sarah, confused. "Trust me." Sarah entered the building behind Mr. Thompson, who led her directly to the meeting room. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Sarah, this is exactly what I was afraid of," said Mr. Thompson, closing the door. "You were specifically instructed not to interact with this person. Mr. Thompson, he was trying to warn me about something important." "Important?" "Sarah, you're letting yourself be manipulated by a hustler who probably wants to use you to gain access to the building." "That's not true." "How can you be so sure? You've known this man for 2 weeks. Do you know anything about his past? About where he lives? About his family?" Sarah opened her mouth to answer, but realized that Mr. Thompson was right. She really knew almost nothing about Alex's life before she met him. I trust him," Sarah said weakly. "Sarah, I really like you, but I can't protect you anymore. The board has made a final decision. If you are seen interacting with this person one more time, your termination will be immediate." Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes. "Mr. Thompson, please." "Furthermore," continued Mr. "Security has been instructed to remove this person from company property if he is seen in the area again." "You can't do that. He's not causing any trouble." "Sarah, this isn't a discussion. It's a final executive decision." At that moment, Mr. Thompson's secretary knocked on the door. "Mr. Thompson, sorry to interrupt, but there's a strange situation happening in the lobby." "What kind of situation?" "It's Mr. Sterling. He arrived a few minutes ago, but he's different, and he's asking specifically for Ms. Sarah." Sarah felt all the blood drain from her face. Alexander Sterling was the CEO of the company, the most powerful man in the building, someone she had only seen once, from a distance during her initial orientation. "Mr. Sterling is asking for me," whispered Sarah. "That can't be right." Mr. Thompson also looked confused. "Have you had any contact with Mr. Sterling?" "No, never. I wouldn't even know him if I saw him." But as she spoke, a terrible suspicion began to form in Sarah's mind. Alex's education, his knowledge of business management, the way he talked about treating employees, his strange dignity even dressed in shabby clothes. "No," murmured Sarah to herself, "it's not possible." Sarah followed Mr. Thompson to the lobby with trembling legs, her mind in complete turmoil. The suspicion that had begun to form was so absurd, so impossible, that she tried to reject it completely. But small details began to fit together like pieces of a terrible puzzle. Alex's education, his knowledge of management, the way he observed the building every day. When they arrived at the lobby, Sarah saw a man in an impeccable suit talking to the security guards. He had his back to her, but there was something familiar in his posture. When the man turned around, Sarah's world completely collapsed. It was Alex. But it wasn't Alex. The man before her had the same face, the same voice, the same gentle eyes that she had come to know. But now he was clean-shaven, with perfectly styled hair, wearing a suit that probably cost more than she earned in 6 months. And all the employees around him bowed slightly when they spoke to him, treating him with a deference she had never seen. "Ms. Sarah Miller," said Alexander, approaching her with an expression that mixed nervousness and determination. Sarah couldn't speak. She couldn't even breathe properly. Her mind tried to process the impossibility of what she was seeing, but the reality was undeniable. Alex, the man she had treated as a beggar, whom she had fed with her own lunch, to whom she had offered advice on job training, was Alexander Sterling, the billionaire owner of the company where she worked. "Sarah," said Alexander more softly, noticing her state of shock. I... Sarah tried to form words, but her voice came out as a strangled whisper. The humiliation hit like a giant wave. Not only had she treated her supreme boss like an indigent, but she had spent entire weeks talking about his company as if he were a stranger, complaining about corporate policies, praising her work as if she were educating someone who knew nothing about the business world. "Mr. Sterling," interrupted Mr. Thompson, clearly confused. "Is there a problem with Ms. Miller?" Alexander looked at Mr. Thompson, then back at Sarah, who was turning visibly pale. "I need to speak with Ms. Miller in private now." "Of course, Mr. Sterling, you can use my office." But Sarah suddenly recoiled, shaking her head desperately. No, I can't do this." And before anyone could stop her, Sarah ran out of the building. Alexander followed her immediately, shouting her name, but Sarah had already disappeared into the crowd on Fifth Avenue. She ran aimlessly, tears streaming down her face, her mind a whirlwind of humiliation, betrayal, and absolute despair. When she finally stopped, she was several blocks away, gasping and sobbing on a park bench. The reality of the situation began to crystallize in her mind. Alexander Sterling, the most powerful man in the company, a billionaire, had pretended to be in need. Why? To amuse himself at her expense? To test how employees treated poor people? To humiliate her in an elaborate way? All the conversations they had had flashed through her mind like a painful movie. She had talked about her financial difficulties, about having to work 2 jobs, about her mother's expensive medications. She had treated a billionaire with pity, offering food, giving advice on how to get a job. The mortification was so intense that she felt physically nauseous, but worse than the humiliation was the feeling of betrayal. Sarah had developed genuine feelings for Alex, admiration, affection, even something that could have become love. She had defended him against the criticism of her co-workers. She had risked her job for him, and it had all been an elaborate lie. Her phone began to ring incessantly. First calls from Mr. Thompson, then from numbers she didn't recognize. Sarah turned off the phone, unable to face any conversation. When she finally arrived home in the middle of the afternoon, something she had never done since she started working at Sterling Enterprises, she found Carol waiting for her with concern. "Sarah, what are you doing home? Why are you crying?" Sarah collapsed into her mother's arms and told her everything. Every humiliating detail, every moment of naivety, every kind word she had wasted on someone who was probably laughing at her the whole time. "Honey," said Carol softly, "are you sure he was laughing at you?" "Mom, he's a billionaire. He pretended to be poor to make a fool of me. But why? What would he gain from that?" Sarah stopped sobbing for a moment, considering her mother's question. I don't know. Maybe he was testing the employees. Maybe it's something rich people do for fun." "Sophia, in all those days you talked, was he ever cruel to you? Did he laugh at you? Did he make you feel inferior?" "No, but..." Sarah paused. "In fact, Alex had always been kind, respectful, even vulnerable at times. But that makes it all worse, Mom, because I really liked him. I thought I had found someone special, someone who saw me for who I really am. But he knew me the whole time. He knew where I worked, how much I earned. He probably read my employee file. He had all the advantages, and I didn't know anything." Carol hugged her daughter tighter. "And now? What are you going to do?" "I can't go back there, Mom. I can't look at him knowing I was so naive, and I've probably already been fired anyway. Running out during my shift the way I did." "Sarah, you have to go back." "What?" "Mom, I can't. Honey, you spent weeks defending this man when you thought he was poor. You risked your job for him. You talked about human dignity and about treating all people with respect. Those values don't change just because you found out he has money. But he tricked me. Maybe he had a reason. Maybe you should at least hear it before you judge. Sarah shook her head violently. I can't, Mom. The humiliation is too great. Everyone in the company must know by now. They must be laughing at how the idiot receptionist treated the CEO like a beggar. And what if they are? Does that change who you are? Does it change the fact that you acted with kindness and compassion? It changes everything, because now I look like a fool who can't even recognize her own boss. That night, Sarah didn't go to work at the diner. For the first time in years, she simply stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to process how her life had transformed so completely in a matter of hours. She had lost not only a job, but also something she thought was the beginning of a genuine relationship. Worst of all was the feeling that she had been seen as a curiosity, an interesting social experiment for a bored billionaire. Every kind moment they had shared now seemed tainted by the fundamental inequality between them, an inequality that she was unaware of, but that he was fully aware of the whole time. When she finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning, Sarah dreamed that she was back in the lobby of Sterling Enterprises. But this time all the employees were pointing at her and laughing, while Alexander Sterling watched from afar with an amused expression. She woke up knowing that she didn't have the courage to face that building again. Sarah spent 3 days locked in her apartment, ignoring the insistent calls from unknown numbers and the messages that piled up on her cell phone. Carol tried to convince her to at least read the messages, but Sarah flatly refused. The wound of humiliation was still too fresh, too painful to be touched. On the 3rd day, Connie appeared at the door with a worried expression that Sarah had never seen on the experienced cook. "Girl, you need to get back to the diner," said Connie as soon as Carol let her in. "The manager is saying that if you don't show up today, he's going to have to hire someone else." "I don't care," muttered Sarah from the sofa, still in her pajamas. "Let him hire someone." "Sarah, have you gone crazy?" Connie sat down next to her. "You can't lose both jobs at the same time. I've already lost the one at Sterling Enterprises anyway." "You don't know that. No one has officially fired you." "Connie, I ran screaming from the building in front of the owner of the company. You don't need a dismissal letter to know that I don't work there anymore." The cook observed Sarah for a long moment. "Girl, I've known you for 2 years. You're not the type to give up. What's really going on here?" Sarah finally looked at Connie, her eyes red from crying so much. "He made a fool of me, Connie. For weeks, I was treating a billionaire as if he were a poor soul who needed my help." "So what?" "What do you mean, so what? You think he was having fun at your expense?" "I don't know what to think. I just know that I feel like a complete idiot." Connie was silent for a moment, then said something that caught Sarah completely by surprise. "I met that man." Sarah sat up straight immediately. "What do you mean?" "Alexander Sterling. He showed up at the diner last week, late at night when you had already left. He was wearing those shabby clothes you described." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "What did he want?" "He asked about you. He wanted to know what you were like as a person, if you had always been kind to everyone, or if you treated you differently from other customers." Sarah felt her breathing becoming uneven. "And what did you say?" "I told him the truth, that you're the kindest person I know, that you treat the homeless person who comes to pick up food scraps with the same respect, that you treat the executives who show up there in the early hours of the morning, that you always ask about people's families, always remember everyone's names." Why was he asking those things? That's what you need to find out, girl. "But I can tell you one thing. That man wasn't having fun at your expense. He looked tortured, like someone who had done something he didn't know how to fix." Sarah processed this information in silence. After a few minutes, she asked, Did he say anything else? He said that you were the first person in years who had treated him like a human being without wanting anything in return, and that he was in love with you. The words hit Sarah like a lightning bolt. He said that in those exact words. Sarah got up abruptly, beginning to walk back and forth across the room. Her mind was in turmoil, reprocessing all the conversations she had had with Alexander, trying to find signs of falsehood, of manipulation. Connie, even if he has genuine feelings, that doesn't change the fact that he lied to me. How can I trust someone who started our friendship with such a big lie? Girl, have you ever stopped to think why a man like him would do such a thing? What would he have to gain? Sarah stopped walking. I don't know. Then find out. That night, for the first time in 3 days, Sarah returned to work at the diner, but her mind wasn't there. She served the customers mechanically, while rethinking every moment she had spent with Alexander. She remembered the way he had looked when she offered the sandwich, as if he were genuinely touched. She remembered how he had listened attentively when she talked about her mother, how his eyes had filled with genuine compassion. She remembered how he had tried to warn her about the threat to her job. But she also remembered how she had felt exposed and vulnerable when she discovered the truth. How each intimate conversation now seemed tainted by the inequality she was unaware of. At the end of her shift, Sarah made a decision. She picked up her phone and for the first time in 3 days, looked at the accumulated messages. There were 17 messages from Alexander. The first said simply, "Sarah, please let me explain." The last, sent just a few hours earlier, said, "I understand if you never want to see me again, but you need to know that every moment we spent together was real for me. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met." Between these messages, there were explanations, apologies, and something Sarah didn't expect: complete vulnerability. Alexander had written about how he felt isolated in his position, how he hadn't had a genuine conversation with someone who didn't want something from him in years, how the days he spent watching her work were the happiest he had had in a long time. Sarah read each message twice, feeling her anger slowly transform into something more complicated. She was still hurt, still felt betrayed, but she was beginning to understand that perhaps the situation was more complex than she had initially thought. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a determination she hadn't felt in days. She took a shower, put on her best clothes, and said to Carol, "Mom, I'm going back to Sterling Enterprises." To work? To have a conversation that should have happened 3 days ago. Carol smiled for the first time since Sarah had arrived home crying. That's my girl. When Sarah arrived at the Sterling Enterprises building, she felt her legs trembling again. But this time, it wasn't just fear. It was determination mixed with nervousness. She had questions that needed answers, and she wasn't going to run away from the situation anymore. As she entered the lobby, she noticed that several employees looked at her with ill-disguised curiosity. The story had obviously spread, but Sarah kept her head held high, heading directly to the reception desk where her temporary replacement was working. "I need to speak with Mr. Sterling," said Sarah with a firmness that surprised herself. "Sarah!" Mr. Thompson appeared immediately. "Are you okay? Where have you been?" "Mr. Sterling is—" "I know where he is," interrupted Sarah, "and I'm going to talk to him now." Sarah went up to the top floor of the building for the first time since she had worked at Sterling Enterprises. The elevator seemed to climb eternally, giving her too much time to question her decision. When the doors finally opened, she found herself in an environment completely different from the rest of the building. More reserved, more elegant, clearly the sanctuary of the top executives. Alexander's secretary greeted her with barely disguised surprise. "Miss Miller, Mr. Sterling isn't expecting—" "Is he?" asked Sarah directly. "Yes, but then I need to talk to him." Alexander was standing in front of the panoramic window of his office, watching the city below, when Sarah entered. He turned around immediately, and she could see the relief mixed with apprehension in his eyes. Sarah, he said softly. Alexander, she replied, using his real name for the first time. Or should I call you Mr. Sterling? Sarah, please! No! Sarah raised her hand, stopping him before he could continue. First, I'm going to talk. For 3 days, I felt like a complete idiot. I felt humiliated, betrayed, used. I thought you had lied to me just to have fun at my expense. Alexander opened his mouth to protest, but Sarah continued. But then I started to rethink our conversations, every single one of them. And you know what I realized? That at no point did you lie about who you are as a person. You lied about your financial situation, about your social position, but never about your feelings, never about your values. Sarah, let me finish. Her voice was getting stronger, more confident. I read all your messages, and they made me understand something I didn't want to admit, that you were just as scared as I was. Scared that if I knew who you really were, our connection would disappear. Alexander approached slowly. And did it? Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. Almost. For 3 days, it almost disappeared completely, because I felt like our entire friendship had been built on a lie. It was built on a lie, admitted Alexander, and I'm so sorry for that. More than you can imagine. Why did you do it, Alexander? Why did you pretend to be someone else? Alexander sighed deeply, running his hands through his hair. Because for years, no one has seen me as just Alexander. Everyone who approaches me wants something, a promotion, an investment, a social connection. When you treated me as Alex, as just a man who needed kindness, I felt free. For the first time in years, someone liked me for who I am, not for what I have. But that doesn't justify. It doesn't justify it, you're right. But Sarah, you need to understand. When you offered me that sandwich, when you cared about me enough to risk your job, when you talked about human dignity, that was the most real thing that has ever happened to me. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes. And I felt like a fool for offering food to a billionaire. You felt like a fool for being kind? The question hit her like a punch. Sarah stopped, processing his words. No, she said slowly. I felt like a fool for not recognizing you. Sarah, there are hundreds of people who work in this building. How many of them do you think would recognize me if they saw me on the street wearing ordinary clothes? I rarely go down to the administrative floors. My picture isn't hanging anywhere. You had no way of knowing. Sarah took a deep breath. But you knew who I was. You knew about my life, about my difficulties, about my mother. You had all the advantages. You're right. And that gave me the opportunity to see who you really are. Sarah, you are the most upstanding person I have ever met. You risked your job to defend someone you thought was a needy stranger. You treated the person you thought was the lowest man on the social ladder with the same dignity you would treat anyone else. That's the least any decent person would do. It's not, Sarah, and you know it's not. How many people passed me by in those days without even looking at me? How many looked the other way? You were the only one who stopped, who cared, who risked something for me. Sarah felt her resistance beginning to give way, but there was still a question that needed to be resolved. Alexander, how can I be sure that you're being honest now? How can I trust someone who started our relationship with such a big lie? Alexander moved closer, stopping just an arm's length away from her. Because I'm giving you a choice that I've never given anyone before, he said softly. I'm asking you to love me, not for what I have, but despite what I have. I'm asking you to see beyond the wealth, beyond the position, and find the man you met as Alex. And what if I can't? What if every time I look at you, I remember how humiliated I felt? Then I'll have to live with that. But Sarah, please don't let my mistake destroy something that could be extraordinary for both of us. Sarah looked around the luxurious office, then back at Alexander. She saw not the billionaire CEO, but the man who had read books on management on the park bench, who had listened attentively when she talked about her mother, who had tried to protect her when he learned that her job was at risk. "I don't know if I can forget how I felt when I found out the truth," said Sarah honestly. "Then don't forget," replied Alexander. "Remember how you felt, but also remember how you felt before. Remember our conversations, our connection. It was real, Sarah. Please tell me you felt that too." Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself to remember. She remembered the first time she had laughed at something Alex had said. She remembered how her heart had raced when he had held her hand briefly when thanking her for the sandwich. She remembered how she had begun to look forward to lunch breaks. "I did," she admitted softly, "and I still do." Alexander took a step forward. "Sarah, I love you. Not as my employee, not as someone I can impress with money or power. I love you as the courageous woman who risked everything to defend what she believed was right. I love you as the person who taught me that there is still genuine kindness in the world." Sarah opened her eyes, meeting his. "Alexander, I love you too. But if we're going to try this, it has to be with complete honesty. No more secrets, no more lies." "No more lies," he promised. "Only truth from now on." Sarah smiled for the first time in days. A genuine smile, full of hope. "Then I guess we can try." Alexander pulled her into his arms, and when their lips met, it was as if all the barriers between them had finally fallen. 6 months later, Sarah Miller was no longer just a receptionist. Alexander had created a new position for her, Director of Human Experience, where she worked to ensure that all employees at Sterling Enterprises, regardless of their position, were treated with dignity and respect. Her reforms revolutionized the company's culture. Carol Miller now had the best medical treatment available, but more importantly than that, she had a daughter who had found not only love, but also her purpose in life. And Alexander Sterling had learned that sometimes the greatest riches come disguised in the simplest forms, in the genuine smile of someone who loves us for who we are, not for what we have. On their wedding day, held in the garden of the house where Sarah had grown up in upstate New York, blending the simplicity she valued with the elegance that was now part of their lives, Sarah held Alexander's hands and said, "I promise to love you as Alex and as Alexander, in the easy days and the difficult ones, in wealth and in simplicity." And Alexander, with tears in his eyes, replied, "I promise to never hide who I am from you again, and to spend the rest of my life deserving the extraordinary love that you gave me when I needed it most." Dear listeners, we hope that Sarah's story has touched your hearts in the same way that it has touched ours. To continue this emotional journey with us, we have prepared a special playlist with equally compelling stories about love, redemption, and the magic of unexpected encounters. You can find it by clicking here on the side. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. This helps us to continue bringing stories that celebrate the best of human nature. Every day we share unique narratives that explore the complexities of love and life. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we look forward to seeing you in the comments to find out which part of Sarah's story touched you the most.